good to see people. I I recognize Roger, and maybe I've interacted with some of you all before. I'm hoping we can make this interactive. And I was going to start with a poll, and I can't figure out how to do that through this version of Zoom. So I will just ask, have you all had any experience with caves or caving? Is this something that you've done before? Roger, have you been in a cave before?
Yes, I have. I mean, I've done Mammoth Cave, and then I've done some caves you're not supposed to be in the Red River Gorge area. So
okay, yeah, that's what I was really wondering. You know, Mammoth Cave is one thing. Uncivilized caves is something very different, and the
yes.
cave crickets that are flying at you, and they're muddy and dirty. They're not my favorite place. Roger, you sound like maybe you're a little more adventurous than I am.
I don't know if it's adventurous or dumb. I mean, a couple of them we probably should have gone in a couple of them, but we went back as got to see what's there.
We're gonna be talking about a cave that someone shouldn't have been in. That someone, Floyd Collins, in 1925. And anyone else, if you want to chime in here, that'd be great. Is this a story that you've heard before? Is this familiar to anyone? You can put in chat. Oh, are we getting more cave? Okay, so other people have been in caves. Yeah, I'm kind of hoping you have had some experience in one of these the unproduced caves, not Mammoth Cave. That's a little different experience, although you can kind of see, get a little bit of a feel. Tracy says, no, you've never heard of the story, Heather. When Wendy first approached me about talking about Kentucky history and thinking about specific topics for this Heroes Grant, this is the one that immediately came to mind. A story from Kentucky history that I think isn't as familiar today, although it certainly has its admirers or people that are intrigued by the story. There have been recent podcasts. There's been a recent film, a musical or a play that someone produced about this story just in the last couple decades. So it's a story that is almost 100 years old, but continues to really fascinate. It's a moment about 2 weeks in early 1925 when the whole nation, if not the world's attention, was focused squarely on Kentucky and this one little part of Kentucky near Cave City, and this one man, Floyd Collins. So I wanted to tell you that story. And I gotta say, I don't know as I've completely figured out how this can be used in teaching. It's just a tale that I think lends itself well to storytelling, but also has applications. So one thing I want you to be thinking about as I'm telling you Collins' tale is, one, how could you use this in a classroom setting, maybe with older students versus younger students, but also to think about, why are we fascinated by stories like this? The so what? What kind of potential do we have to make meaning out of Collins' stories so many years later? And I also want you to think about what it means to be a hero. When we're defining that, why center our attention on heroes per se, and what makes a hero? Because this story, at first, it seems like, oh, okay, this is one that lends itself automatically to pinpointing heroes. But when you get into it, it gets a little more complicated, a little more messy. Is this person a hero, or maybe not so much? So I'm going to ask you at the end who you think are the heroes in this story. Okay, Debbie, you've read a book about this. Have you read this book? This is the one I'm using. And I got a real good bargain on Half Price Books conveniently, but written by a scholar and a caver. The two kind of teamed up come at it from the history and from the caving side of things. So I'm relying heavily on that book by Murray and Brucker. But Floyd Collins, if you haven't heard of him, here's a picture. There you see him in the 1920s. He was 37 years old when Americans suddenly were introduced to this guy who otherwise would have just been a normal everyday guy, would have never been famous in his life, but propelled to fame. He was described as gaunt, with a sharp nose, deep set eyes, and a very distinctive gold front tooth. So that's how people came to know him and what he looked like, although his picture shows up in newspapers all across the country. Collins, to his neighbors, some of them probably viewed him as shiftless, as not much of a go-getter. In a culture where you were expected to work above ground, farming was a main occupation, and this just wasn't Collins' thing. He much preferred to be underground. He saw that as the place where he could best build a future for himself and hopefully his family. Caves a part of his life. He grows up in cave country. You see here near Cave City, so the southwestern part of Kentucky, Green River area. Massive limestone belt ran through this area, creating a very unique topography. And this belt ran from Indiana down through Tennessee, cutting through this area, and this where he grew up more than any place, probably the heart of cave country. Key factors that created this topography involves water and soft rock and years of water eroding this rock underground, creating sinkholes. Even where I'm at here in central Kentucky, sinkholes can be a problem. You can see this kind of shows you the underground passageways as that rock would erode through the action of the water, creating spots where humans could get in underground into passageways or even really impressive rooms. And if you've been in Mammoth Cave, you know what that looks like. But these sinkholes and caves, even though they could produce wonder, and there you see the stalactites, the stalagmites, all of the really amazing view that you get, but they can also cause problems. And we learned that 2014 when Corvettes started falling into them, that was a problem. So this an area where it could offer opportunity, caves, or could offer dangers and problems. Now, indigenous people and those that settled in this area knew right away that these caves existed, and they knew that they could be useful. So for utilitarian purposes, say for shelter, we know Red River Gorge, we see all kinds of caves where humans resided in those. It was an easy way to get a roof over your head, a place to store cool milk or vegetables to keep them longer, or produce. You could put them in there. Maybe a storm comes up and a good place to find protection. So they were utilitarian, but they could also be used for commercial purposes, and people really creative in using these caves. So put in there in chat if you know of what were ways that people could make money off of caves. What were some of the enterprises that go on in these spaces? And if you've taken tours at Mammoth Cave. You've probably heard about the multiple ways these that the cave has been used. Okay, saltpeter and gunpowder made out of saltpeter. So minerals that could be gathered in caves. What else? Anyone know any other ways? I'm a medical historian, so one of my favorite of these uses, it didn't turn out so well, but a very enterprising tuberculosis doctor who decided, oh, this is a good place to send all these people that are suffering for TB. We'll put them together underground. It'll be good for them. It'll be salubrious. In fact, it caused their death. They die in droves. Didn't work out so well. But a guy named Krogan had viewed their potential that way. So that's another thing, a place you could conceal illicit activities, a place you could hide your moonshine. So a place to make some money. But by the 1820s, clearly their greatest economic potential was in tourism. Certainly Mammoth Cave, that was the case. And you can see here visitors who are coming. This is in the 1890s, but as early as the 1820s, people making the trek, hearing about the wonders of Mammoth Cave and wanting to experience it. A very famous tour guide, an enslaved man by the name of Stephen Bishop, who was an expert on Mammoth Cave, took many of these tourists through. If you go on the tour, you'll see where they took their torches and basically put their graffiti on the roof of the torch, drawing their names or leaving their mark there. First, the stagecoach is bringing people, then later the steamboat gets them closer, kind of an encyclopedia of transportation. Later, it's the L&N Railroad that builds a spur that's really close to Mammoth Cave. Later, the automobile. By the 1920s, people coming by the carload. That really expands the accessibility of the cave. Henry Ford's Model T, the motor car for the masses, drawing bigger and bigger crowds. Now, the desire to capture these tourist dollars is going to lead at the turn of the century to what become known as the cave wars. For many farmers who were having a hard time making it, who were kind of sinking in debt, they looked at caves as a way to make some extra money. This could mean going underground. It could mean harvesting onyx or other minerals, setting up little roadside stands between the railroad depot and Mammoth Cave, all kinds of ways to make a little extra money. It was kind of like cutting timber for Eastern Kentucky people. You looked and saw, okay, what do I have at my disposal? I need to pay my tax bills, make a little money that way. But even better would be to open your own cave. Now, Mammoth Cave really had the lock on the tourist traffic, and that tuberculosis doctor I mentioned, John Krogan, his heirs were in control of Mammoth Cave. They really didn't want further exploration to go on because people had a sneaking suspicion that all these caves were connected in some way. Stephen Bishop had really shown and believed this to be the case. But others who spent a lot of time underground realized how these spaces linked up. Now, today we know Mammoth Cave spans over 400 miles. It's very well connected, all these caves. But at the time, we were figuring that out. 1972 is when two big cave systems, the link is discovered between the two and has created Mammoth Cave as we know it today. But in this period, people were convinced that if they could find a new opening to the cave, that they could sort of harness their share of these tourist dollars. And so that becomes the goal for some of these area residents. One man, for instance, a guy named George Morrison in 1907, discovered what became known as the new entrance. And so that gave him a real in on this revenue. The cave wars are going to be really brutal and dirty. Legal challenges in some cases, spreading rumors. People would stand on the side of the road with a sign and say, oh, well, that entrance is closed, go over here. Or they would tell people in the hotel lobby, oh, well, I hear that if you have trouble walking downstairs, if you have any physical impairments, you can't go there, you should come over here. They would try and swindle and urge people to come and pitch their business their way. And so this is part of these cave wars. And Floyd Collins decides he needs to get his share, his piece of the action. Caving was in his blood. He was one of 8 children, a middle kid, a bit of a daredevil. About age 6, he started to go underground. I don't know who lets their 6-year-old down there, but he's going, and he grows up doing this kind of exploration. School, not for him. Even girls, not for him. He prefers just to explore. Collins had discovered a cave of his own on his father's property. It was called Crystal Cave, and it was unique in some ways, very beautiful. It had these crystal formations that looked like flowers on the walls. But the problem was it was hard to get to. It wasn't on the beaten path. It took longer. You had to pass the Mammoth Cave entrance, and most people didn't continue to go that far. So his best efforts to bring in customers were failing. And in 1924, he starts looking for a new cave. And really thinking strategically, smartly, picks out a piece of property very close to Cave City, just off the Cave City Highway. And he says, okay, I've located the place where I want my cave to be. Now I need to just go and find it. Well, he doesn't own this land. Someone else does. So he negotiates with the landowner, tells them, I'll do all the dirty work. If I find this cave and can make it economically viable, I'll split the profits with you. So the landowner agrees, this is okay. And Collins has been busy trying to find an opening into the cave through this piece of property, a new entrance of his own. But this is where his trouble starts. He's exploring a place called Sand Cave. And the name suggests some of the problem. You see here, there's a big opening into this cave. It seemed to lead you right in, but most people gave up right away. Once you got in, everything that seemed so big about it became very tiny and very tight. But Collins was willing to squeeze himself into spaces that most people with any sense would not go into. And he really felt like this was his ticket for his future. On January 30th, he was continuing his explorations as he had been for some weeks. He'd eaten his breakfast with a neighbor. He was staying in this household to make it easier to do his work here. And January 30th, he sets off with his equipment as normal. He goes in, and by this point, he has started to map the cave, all the twists and turns, the path that he needs to take. It included 3 really tight squeezes. And luckily, he was a fairly thin man. Being gaunt helped in this situation. He could squeeze himself. And maybe if you've been to Mammoth Cave, you've been through, I think they call it, they probably have changed the name, Fat Man's Misery. There are even places within Mammoth Cave that are hard. You kind of have to contort yourself. Nothing like what Floyd Collins is doing here, though, these tiny little squeezes, places where he's crawling headfirst down shafts, not knowing what he's going to encounter when he gets down there. Some really crazy things he's doing. And in a place named Sand Cave tells you something about the unstable earth. It was like walking through sand, the ground shifting underneath you. So this is not a smart place to be exploring. And like I said, most people with any sense would have declared it way too dangerous, but Collins had the bug and he had it bad. And he really thinks that this is going to pay off. Now I kind of see this as like a video game. And if you've played, I'm trying to think some of the ones I played growing up, where each time you'd play, you'd maybe get a little further or you'd get past this point. And it really becomes addictive trying to conquer that next level. It's kind of similar with this cave, every day pushing a little further. And so this diagram here, I think, is really useful. This comes from that Murray and Brucker book I said I used. They've drawn this picture. They've gone back into Sand Cave. It's been blocked. You can't, there's bars in front of the entrance, but they were given special permission and they mapped where all of these twists and turns. And you can see here Collins heading down into the earth through these very tight passageways. In most places, there's only room for one person. You can't even turn around. You're crawling on your head first, or you're pushing yourself back up to get out of the cave through these squeezes. And you can see here where Collins is headed. On this day in January, he'd been tunneling for several hours and his lamp started to flicker and he thought, oh, drat, I was really hoping to make more progress, but realized he probably should call it a day. And he starts to inch his way out. So he's gotten down here and now has to make his way back up this shaft. And to do this, he has his lamp in front of him and he's pushing it uphill in front of him. And he manages to flip the light over and it goes out. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're claustrophobic right now, you may need to take some deep breaths. You imagine yourself in this place. Yeah, Jamie, you don't like tight spaces. Tight and dark and dirty. Remember, I don't like the dirt or the cave crickets. But dark now, pitch dark. But Collins is an experienced caver. He's been in situations like this before. This is a day in the life for him. A nuisance, not necessarily an emergency. In fact, one time he had been trapped for 18 hours when his lamp had gone out. So he's prepared to problem solve. And he's kind of memorized, knows the way back out and starts going in that direction, scrunches himself up really small, begins to wiggle back through the tight passageway, forgetting that on the way down, he had seen a rock that was hanging precariously from the ceiling. And he'd had to kind of maneuver around it coming down. He figured the rock weighed about 100 pounds. In the light, he was able to skirt it, but now he forgot that rock. And one ill-advised scrape of his foot brought it down right across his ankle, pinning him. Okay, he probably thought, surely I can wiggle my way out. But every time he would start to wiggle, more debris would come down, and it was filling in the tight space he was in. Before he knew it, he's entirely surrounded. His arms are pinned, both legs are pinned. He cannot move. He's kind of on his side in an awkward way. He was trapped, as someone described it, in a coffin-like straitjacket. There, Jamie, that makes it even worse, doesn't it? It's your fear of tight places. He wasn't going to get out of here on his own. He determined that pretty quickly. Now, you can imagine what you're feeling, and put in chat there if things come to mind, like, well, what about this? What is it that you're worried about if you're Floyd Collins? Any particular worries or problems that you're anticipating? Yeah, who can get to me? Well, Collins, okay, deep breath. He knows that his neighbor, he'd had breakfast with him, and he's actually staying at a neighbor's house. So if he doesn't come home that night, someone's going to notice he's missing, and they know where he's been working. So he thinks, okay, someone will come for me. I just need to be patient. Does anyone know he's there? Is anyone brave enough to help? Yeah, because I mean, like I said, he's kind of crazy to come down into this space. Who can get to me? What about it's dark, so you can't see anything. That could start to really get to you pretty quickly. But again, Collins has been in this situation. It's cold. It's about 54 degrees in the cave, and some water is running through a rock above him and hitting his face, dripping on him. So that's going to make him even colder. He's hungry. He's been in there a couple of hours. So the hunger's gnawing in his stomach. Might have started to wonder what he's going to do when he needs to pee. I imagine that could be a question as well. He's a good Baptist, hard-shell Baptist, so he's started to pray and finally slipped off to sleep mercifully. So he spent the night in uncomfortable, very certainly uncomfortable circumstances, but he reassured himself that someone would be on the way to help. And someone did come 25 hours later. 25 hours from the time he had entered the cave, someone located him. He could hear the yelling. He responded, calmly explained the situation. This young African-American man who was also interested in caves was the one to discover him. And Collins said, "Go get my brothers." His brothers come right away. They can't get in necessarily. There you can see his brothers, Homer and Marshall. I think Marshall was the one that stripped off all his clothes to make himself tinier. He's in his underwear trying to wiggle down so he could get to Floyd. The rescue party, though, at this point doesn't know the extent of his predicament, and they really struggled just to get into him. Finally, after several attempts, Homer manages to reach his brother by going down this shaft head first, and sees this situation is really bad. But Homer, able to get down to him, brings him some things to make it better. A blanket, brings him some light, put something up to keep the water from dripping on him, and fed him like a baby bird, giving him coffee. That made his day better, I'm sure, right there. At least for me, it would. And sandwiches, 9 sausage sandwiches. Floyd eats, to be exact. But the question, how were they going to get him out? And neighbors start to gather. They're hearing, word began to travel. By Sunday, now we're 2 days in, interest in Collins' plight was building. He's about to become a household name. And this happens very quickly. Heroes are about to be made. Americans eating up this story. This is an era of sensational journalism. So newspapers often used gimmicks, eyewitness accounts, artist drawings to try and pique readers' interests. At that particular time, there were no big stories that were drawing attention. It was just a slow news time. Even sports were not. There was not much going on. And so here now Americans had something to pique their interest. It was a great story to tell. This man who's trapped, people trying to get him out, reporters rushed to the scene. And starting Sunday, after he's been there 2 days, the newspaper accounts start to flow. Courier-Journal sends a reporter, as did a lot of papers, their correspondent, a guy named William Miller. And you see Miller here. You can see he's kind of a pipsqueak. That's how he was described. 117 pounds, called Skeets because, as people said, he was no bigger than a mosquito. But that's going to really be good for him as a reporter. He gets there on Monday morning. A lot of people had beat him to the punch. A lot of correspondents were there, but no one had been brave enough to go in. Some had tried. They'd gotten a little ways in, usually in their suits and ties, and they chickened out. But Miller decides he is going to get in there and he is going to talk to Floyd Collins. And so he changes out of his suit into some coveralls and doesn't have any cave experience, but makes it through the twists and turns and gets down to that shaft leading to Collins and basically lands headfirst onto him. Collins says, "You're hurting me." Wait, it was an awkward introduction, but Collins and Miller will become friends. They are going to get to know each other very well because Skeets Miller is one of the only ones who is brave enough to make it into Collins. And he spends many hours there. He would leave periodically to nap for a couple hours, get a meal, file his stories, but then he would come back and he spent hours talking to Collins. Collins, in exchange for the moral support that Miller provided, gave him an incredible story, told him step by step how he had come to be in this situation. And Miller, having a firsthand story to offer, really helps humanize Collins for readers. They're hearing about this man, not just about his circumstance, but really getting to know this guy. Now, there are others that are showing up at the cave. One ambitious member of the Louisville Rescue Squad, a guy named Robert Burton, showed up about the time that Skeets Miller got there. And he too makes his way into the cave. He's there in part because he thinks this is going to get him a big promotion. It's going to get him promoted from lieutenant to captain. And so he feels like for him, there's a lot riding on what happens to Collins. And he has an idea that he feels very passionate about. He believes that the best way to get to Collins, the best way to get him out is to just pull him with all they've got. Now, that foot is, remember, pinned, and Burton said likely his foot's going to rip off, but better than the alternative. And so he makes his case. He gets Collins to agree to this, and Collins kind of wavers back and forth. Sometimes he's like, yeah, anything to get me out of here. Other times he's thinking, I don't think I want my foot ripped off like that. That sounds pretty brutal. Doctors say this is a terrible idea. In pulling Collins out like that, they said before his foot rips off, you're going to rip his shoulder and his chest muscles and all of his internal organs to shreds. This cannot end well, the doctors say. But Burton's all about this. And he goes off and he gets a harness and he attaches it to Collins. He gives him a sedative, some whiskey, even though Collins is a teetotaler and it's prohibition, the whiskey, very welcome. And they start to pull. And right away, Collins, he's like, no way, I cannot do this. And the effort fails before Collins is dismembered, luckily. Other plans considered, some say what they need to do is dig a shaft down to Collins. But locals, people that knew caves well, said that was too risky, that it would cause the existing passageway to cave in and there would be no way to get to him. Someone else said, oh, let's use a blowtorch to burn the rock that's above him away to get more room. But others say in that tight space, any kind of blowtorch is going to incinerate Collins. So they're throwing ideas back and forth. In some cases, they're using technology to their benefit. They sent down some light bulbs, and Collins had a light. He had the warmth from the light. He had blankets. They're continuing to feed him the whole time and bring him warm beverages. Meanwhile, Americans are following every single detail of the story. Many of the stories are inaccurate. The AP picked up the story by Monday, and they're running these across the country. Yesterday, I ran a search on newspapers.com, and if you do historical research, newspapers.com, it's expensive, but it is an amazing tool, and you can do searches very easily. I looked in February of 1925 for the name Floyd Collins, and there were at least 18,000 hits just in the newspapers that have been digitized within newspapers.com. So, I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of stories about Collins are in people's papers. Prayer services being held across the country, all-night vigils. In New York City, theater performances would pause every few minutes to give Collins updates. Radio adding to the interest and making this a more compelling story because people can hear minute by minute what's going on. Other technologies of the 1920s, motion pictures, a motion picture crew shows up. This is the era of silent films, but they're going to document it in video. And every day the story's getting more elaborate. They're relying on a lot of old stereotypes that this is a backwoods place, that these are strange people, barely educated. Collins' father especially was easy to stereotype. Some people threw in a fictitious love story, said his fiance was outside the cave longing for his return. He wasn't engaged. Some said that his dog was out there waiting too, howling mournfully, dying of a broken heart, which all of this was false, but it added to the allure of his story, creating suspense more important than telling the truth. By Tuesday evening, a rescue seemed imminent, and a lot of this had to do with Skeets Miller and his efforts to get down there. He was by hand clawing out a lot of the gravel and rock that had situated around Collins and had gotten down to where he could reach Collins's ankle and called for a jack and a crowbar, and he worked at it, trying to dislodge the boulder for hours till he was absolutely exhausted. But people were thinking any moment now that Floyd Collins would be freed. But on Wednesday, all these hopes turned into sorrow when the roof of this passageway, there was a cave in the chute, and it cut rescuers off from Collins. So this is Wednesday. We're not quite at a week yet. They've been feeding and watering Collins. They've been keeping him company, keeping him sane. Now, all of a sudden, people can't get to him again at all. And rescuers realize pretty quickly that they're all in danger. If anyone goes down there, the whole thing may fill in. And so they have to give up this effort to get him out the way he came. You can see, here's another picture, mental floss. I said people continue to be really interested in this story. So someone has drawn this diagram showing how they were able to reach Collins because Skeets Miller's so small and they kind of cleared out that last little bit of the passageway. He can get down to Collins, and that's how he clears out some of that debris, but that rock is still on his foot. At this point, they got to go to plan B. And businesses, companies had been sending in equipment. Experts had been appearing from Louisville and other places, Bowling Green, with ideas on how they should get Collins out. There had been a lot of friction between locals and these outsiders. But finally now, no alternative. They've got to dig a shaft to get to him through a different way. And the work gets more organized. The governor sends in the National Guard to control the growing crowd. Experts are summoned, people from UK, engineers. The governor says the purse strings of Kentucky are open. Anything it takes to get this man out. As one of the National Guard officials described it, the practical men had had their way, and now the men with brains, the trained, the professionals were coming in. And they do create a map and an engineering survey, and they decide we've got to dig this shaft down in. Just going to try and get there. You can see the shaft that they plan. And they're going to take a drill. That's the first thought. But then they realize that they may kill Collins if they try and do that. Exhaust would enter the shaft. There'd be too much vibration. This was too dangerous. So they end up using pick and shovel, going foot by foot, about 65 feet down to try and get to him. And by Friday, most people who know what's going on have realized this is more of a recovery effort than a rescue effort. But Americans are still pulling for Collins. They are making the trip to Sand Cave to see for themselves. And that weekend, people just pour in, all these gawkers. The crowd grows to about 2,000 on Saturday, and Cave City is this little tiny place of about 600 people. So what is bad for Collins is really good for entrepreneurs. Roads were clogged. I kind of picture what happened recently with Asbury University and the revivals that have been going on, and the roads were all clogged. That's what's happening here. People described it as like a country fair, a religious revival. On Sunday, about, well, estimates vary, somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 people came to Sand Cave. And you can see here part of these people. Hamburger stands are set up, hucksters, they're hawking their wares. One popular item were helium balloons that said Sand Cave, and almost every kid had one, according to accounts. Floyd's brother was selling pictures of him for $1 a piece. So this was a big event for the nation. All these people hoping to be there when the poor man is freed, but alas, still no Floyd. As the crowds start to thin out, as the next week begins, some were getting skeptical. Some were wondering if this is even real. Some were suggesting that every night Floyd had a back door and he would get out and go home and sleep in his own bed. There were Floyd Collins sightings across the country. Local officials began an investigation. Some were arguing that, oh, the family did this just for publicity. Some were saying, oh, it's the newspapers who are trying to gain readership, or no, it's the L&N Railroad who did this to profit off of it. So a lot of real skepticism. But at least the newspapers then had something to cover, because the rescue operation was going at a snail's pace. The shaft that they had to go down, even once they made it to the bottom, which took many, many days longer than they expected, then they had to tunnel over laterally to get to him. Some people thought, oh, okay, Friday the 13th is going to be the lucky day. It wasn't. Some people thought the next day, Valentine's Day, that would be the day that made the nation's heart surge. But every day passed with no good news. Some people thought the next Sunday would be a repeat of that really crazy carnival day. It didn't happen. And still no release of the trapped man. Finally, on the Monday, about 17 days after Collins had gone into the cave, after digging 64 feet down and then 12 and a half feet over, a rescuer popped out from the cave and uttered one, or from the hole, the shaft, I guess, and uttered one word: dead. Collins likely had been dead at least a day, probably several days. The cost to Kentucky, $200,000, all to rescue what one of his neighbors called a caving fool. But even once they found his body, they could still not get him out. They'd come in at his head again, and they were back where they started. And the decision was made: Collins' body would remain in the cave. This would be his death chamber. But officials, they knew all the skepticism, the rumors that were floating around. So they said, we need to have a way to prove that he's been found. And one official said, we should cut off his finger and take it out. And others said, no, that's not a good idea. We'll take a photo of him down there and that will be the proof. But still people said, oh, they're making it up. The family gathered the next day, and here you can see his body removed from the cave. The family had a funeral on site when it was believed he would be left there in the cave. 384 hours his ordeal had dragged on. They paid their final respects, but they wanted his body back. And so they hired a mining team to go in, and in April, they managed to free his corpse and give it a proper burial near the family home site. But later he's going to be dug up. He's going to be dug up several times. His poor body dug up to be placed. Oh yeah, Tracy, not how you wanted it to end. That's not, yeah, Americans were hanging on every move and they didn't want it to end this way either. His body, when it's exhumed later, will be placed in Crystal Cave, the cave he had discovered on his parents' land, which they had since sold to someone else. And the person who bought it convinced him that that's what Floyd would have wanted, to be his body to be in the cave. But they set it up with a glass top so people could pose and take their picture. He was a spectacle as much in death as he had been in the last weeks of his life. Someone tried to steal the body out of Crystal Cave, dragged it off. And remember, the leg has been sawed off to get him out. And the corpse quickly recovered, although I don't think they ever found that severed leg. This is a brutal story, I know. But I want us to take the last few minutes here. And if you can unmute, that would be great. We can do this through chat. But to think about what we do with this story. And I will say, we've had recent similar stories. I know some of you, Jamie, you're not old enough to remember baby Jessica, I suspect. But maybe you've heard the story. Oh, yeah, you have. Okay. So baby Jessica fell into, she about a year old, 1987, well at her aunt's house in Texas. And yeah, I mean, think of Floyd Collins' story was really similar in a lot of ways. More recently, you remember this one a couple years ago. What was that, 2018? Thailand, these dozen or so soccer players. Heather, you were 10, so you probably remember baby Jessica then. Yeah, a warning story for you. Yeah, for sure. But the whole nation on the edge of its seat to see this person rescued, these young boys rescued, and their coach. What was it? Elon Musk's used the powers, some of his cutting edge technology to try and get them out. So we have similar cases that we become really fascinated with. And so I want us to think, why is that? Why does this hold such an allure for us? What kind of meaning can we make out of Floyd Collins' story? Who are the heroes? And thinking about how we teach it, I wonder if any ideas have come to mind. And here you can see, I just pulled one piece of the coverage. This was after he had been found dead. And read this middle piece, you can see the kind of moralizing, philosophizing that's going on too, as the nation's seeking closure, how they're making sense of this. But I'm curious to see what you all think about why these stories captivate us so much and what we do with it. So anyone who's willing to share, I will stop sharing here in a second. I'll give you a chance to look at that maybe.
Well, this is Debbie. Found it to be a super fascinating story. You actually had several details that I haven't heard before, and I think it's an example of media getting too involved. So I think that's an aspect where we could teach it, where media can interfere with, trying this rescue. I also think it's very just interesting history about the caving, what you said about the cave wars, where they were trying to get some people to come to their caves and things like that. I think it's just a very interesting piece of Kentucky history at that time.
Yeah, that's good. But yeah, the media coverage, both from the newspaper and the radio perspective, really interesting. And I wonder if stories today don't develop in a similar way. Like, it starts with maybe here's what's happening, but then it becomes all these side stories, the romance, the dog, like adding the human interest, some of it that's not even true. And then it morphed into, well, is this even real, or is this all fake news? And so the ebb and flow of the coverage, kind of interesting to think about if there are similarities in stories that we hear today. It's good. Yeah, others, and certainly the cave wars economically are a really interesting part of Western Kentucky history. Who do we think were the heroes in this story? Anyone want to nominate a hero that comes out of it? Is Collins himself a hero? And how does this maybe complicate our idea of a hero? it gives us someone to pull for. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and don't we want to feel like we're connected in some way, that we're part of a larger community? Skylar, yeah, Miller, I think, is the clear, if there's a hero to nominate out of here, it's this young man who's never been in a cave, who goes to extraordinary lengths. Then he started out, he wants to get the scoop. This is going to be good for his career, but it did not continue that way, at least if we believe, and I haven't read the documents myself, but this book that I pointed to really makes the case that he has a legitimate, he feels compassion for Collins, and really gets to know him and admires him, and is willing to sacrifice his own comfort and safety. And even after, I think what's so interesting, Miller could have gone on the Chautauqua circuit. He'd been promised like $50,000 to go out and speak about Floyd Collins and the events. And he says, no, I want to be a reporter. I want to do what I've been doing. He wins a Pulitzer, so it's good for his career, but he really does, he doesn't seem to be motivated by money like some of the others were, because even Collins's brothers are trying to profit off of this. Yeah, it's hard to see Collins as a hero, because and you sometimes hear people who find themselves held up as a hero, and they're like, I wouldn't have chosen this, and what else am I going to do? I just have to deal the or play the hand I've been dealt. And so it's hard to see him as a hero. Yeah, and explorers, I always think that about Daniel Boone and others who are taking great risks. And sometimes if they pay off, we tend to see that as more heroic than if they don't. And in this case, it didn't pay off. Although certainly if having notoriety and being remembered, Floyd Collins has been. I said there was a play, Robert Penn Warren wrote a novel about him. He continues to be well remembered today. There used to be a museum to Floyd Collins. I think that has closed, but when you go to Mammoth Cave, you still hear his story. And the state of Kentucky, because of the attention that was paid to this, a lot of people really start pushing to expand the national park there at Mammoth Cave. And they do purchase Floyd Collins' family home in 1960. Okay, Jamie, anything else? Questions or thoughts? I kind of see for younger children, you could tell this story in a way that, Floyd Collins is kind of a hero. For older students, though, it allows you to complicate this idea and show that we're human. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Goan. And I just dropped a link there in the chat, but I think it's the wrong one. So let me repost that. I think I sent the edit one first there. Thank you, Dr. Goan. You definitely sparked my claustrophobia there for a little while. I'm so scared of tight spaces. So I was like, oh my gosh.
Just don't go to any caves. And
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about the crickets either.
No, but that was a new story to me. So I thank you for sharing that.
Sure. Yeah.
Unless
have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Goan. You too. And I will hang out here as usual. If you guys have any questions or anything you need me to let Wendy know, I'll be glad to do that. But I hope you guys have a great evening and enjoy the beautiful weather.